When a USPS driver picks up a routine package, he never imagined it would change the life of a family forever. James Walker had spent over 20 years behind the wheel of his USPS delivery van, navigating the winding streets of Mississippi, Illinois, like the back of his hand. Experience had sharpened his instincts, and today, as he pulled up in front of Brad Williams' house, something went wrong. The house stood at the far end of the cul-de-sac, its paint peeling at the edges. The lawn was overgrown, littered with leaves that hadn't been raked in seasons. A single curtain twitched in the front window, then stilled. James exhaled sharply, pushing away the unease creeping up his spine. He pressed the doorbell, listening as the chime echoed faintly inside. A long pause. Then, the sound of tiny, hesitant footsteps. When the door creaked open, a small black girl stood before him. She couldn't have been older than 6, her frame thin beneath an oversized sweatshirt that swallowed her arms. Emily. Her wide brown eyes flickered up at him, her fingers twisting anxiously into the hem of her sleeve. A second later, another child appeared, smaller, younger. Emma, no more than 4, clung to her sister, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around Emily's waist. She peered up at him, her lower lip trembling before she whispered, "Mister, do you have any food?" James felt something cold settle in his stomach. It wasn't just the words, it was the way Emily stiffened at her sister's question, the way her hand shot out, gripping Emma's wrist, as if to silence her. The way she looked over her shoulder just once before dropping her gaze to the floor. "Your parents home, sweetheart?" James asked gently, scanning the dimly lit hallway behind them. Emily's lips pressed together, her small hands balled into fists at her sides. The hesitation was telling. After what felt like an eternity, she mumbled, "Dad doesn't like us talking to strangers." James nodded slowly, though unease coiled tighter in his chest. He had seen children answer the door for parents before, but never like this. Not with their shoulders hunched. Not with fear etched into every movement. "Well, I can't take this package unless an adult signs for it," he said carefully, testing the waters. Emily flinched, like she'd just been caught doing something she shouldn't. Emma, still clinging to her sister, whimpered softly. Something wasn't right. James glanced toward the driveway. No car. No signs of movement inside. Only the eerie stillness of a house that fell far too silent. He shifted his weight. Should he press further? His job wasn't to pry, but walking away now, leaving these girls in a house where something was clearly wrong, felt impossible. Then he made a decision. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm but direct. 911, what's your emergency? James kept his eyes on the girls, lowering his voice. I'm a USPS delivery driver. I'm at a residence where 2 young children just answered the door, alone. They seem scared. They asked for food. Emily's head snapped up. Her face, pale before, turned ghostly white. She shook her head frantically, her eyes pleading. Before she could speak, a car engine rumbled in the distance. James turned. A battered old sedan rounded the corner and pulled into the driveway just as a police cruiser appeared down the street. The driver's door slammed. A man in his mid-30s stepped out, Brad Williams. He was unshaven, his shirt wrinkled, his expression flickering between confusion and something darker. His eyes locked onto the girls, then James, then the approaching police car. James saw it then, the brief flash of panic. But just as quickly as it came, Brad forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding," he called out as the police stepped from their vehicle. "I was just out grabbing groceries. I must have been gone for 10 minutes, tops." "My kids are fine." James looked back at Emily. She stood motionless, Emma clutching the hem of her shirt. Not once did she lift her head. Not once did she meet her father's eyes. The officers exchanged a glance before approaching the porch. "Sir, we'll need to verify some information with you," one of them said. "Can we see some identification?" Brad nodded quickly, almost too quickly, fumbling in his back pocket for his wallet. Yeah, of course. Look, I appreciate the concern, but really, this is all just a big mix-up." One officer took the ID while the other turned to James. "Sir, did the children say they were in danger?" James hesitated. No, not directly. But he had seen it. The fear, the hunger, the way Emily had gone rigid the moment Brad appeared. "They asked for food," James said finally. "And they looked scared." The officer's gaze flickered to the girls. Emily's hands trembled. Emma shrank behind her. Brad let out a nervous chuckle. "Kids are always hungry," he said, his tone light, too light. "I swear I leave them for 5 minutes and they're already acting like they haven't eaten in days." One officer knelt to the girl's level. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Emily gave the smallest nod. Emma said nothing. The officer looked back at James. "We appreciate your concern for the children's welfare, sir. But it's important to be certain before calling emergency services. False alarms take resources away from real emergencies." James felt a wave of unease settle over him. Had he overreacted? The girls had looked frightened, but maybe it was nothing. Maybe he had imagined the worst. Shifting on his feet, he let out a slow breath and nodded. "I understand, officer. I'm sorry if I caused any trouble." With that, the officers wrapped up their questioning. Brad, still smiling, ushered his daughters inside. As James stepped off the porch and headed back to his van, Emma turned to her sister, her voice barely a whisper. "He's gone, right?" she asked, gripping Emily's sleeve. "What do we do now?" Emily didn't answer. She just held Emma closer, her tiny shoulders trembling as they stood there, small and silent, in the dim hallway. James pulled away from the house with the box. On the way, his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind is anything but. He tried to shake it off, forcing himself to focus on the route ahead. His thoughts drifted to his nephew, to the way the boy would giggle as he exaggerated his hunger, pointing dramatically at the snack pantry, eyes full of mischief. But those little girls back at the house, there had been no mischief in their faces, no playful exaggeration, no teasing glint in their eyes, just raw, naked need. Hunger, yes, but something else too, something darker. James exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw. Maybe I'm overthinking things. Maybe it's just the heat messing with my head. He pulled up to his next stop, parking the truck. The routine of it all, the scanning, the unloading, the placing of parcels, usually brought a kind of rhythm to his day, a steady pulse of movement that kept his mind clear. He moved to the back of the truck, reaching for the next package, when something shifted in his peripheral vision. A box, Brad Williams' box, had tumbled onto its side during the drive. Nothing unusual about that. Packages shifted all the time. But as he bent down to retrieve it, his eyes snagged on something that made his breath hitch. A slip of paper taped to the underside. Not part of the packaging. Not a shipping label. A note. James set the package down carefully, as if it might shatter under the weight of whatever truth it carried. The writing was crude, the letters uneven and wobbly, as if scrawled by an unsteady hand. "We are girls. Call 911. His pulse drummed against his ribs. He read it again as if the meaning might change, as if he might have misunderstood. He hadn't. James straightened slowly, the street around him suddenly too quiet. He could hear his own breathing, feel the sweat gathering at the nape of his neck, despite the shade of the truck. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't the heat. This was a cry for help. His hand found his phone before he'd even made the decision. He pressed the familiar numbers, lifting the device to his ear. The line clicked. 911, what's your emergency? His voice came out steady, but there was a tightness beneath it. This is James. I called earlier about a house on Miller Road. 2 young girls left alone. I found something. He hesitated, pressing his fingers to his forehead, then continued. A note. Someone inside that house is asking for help. The dispatcher's tone shifted, losing some of its earlier patience. Sir, we already responded to that call. The officers found no immediate cause for concern. James clenched his jaw. Then they missed something. A pause. Then, carefully, Sir, are you sure this isn't just, damn it, listen to me, James cut in, his voice low, firm. Someone inside that house is in trouble. If you don't send someone back, and something happens to those girls. He let the unfinished sentence hang, heavy, with unspoken consequences. Another silence. Then, begrudgingly, we'll send a unit to follow up. It wasn't the reassurance he wanted, but it was something. James ended the call and exhaled slowly, staring at the note once more before tucking it carefully into his pocket. Still, something gnawed at him. The last time he called, the police had shown up within minutes. But now, the hesitation in the dispatcher's voice, the vague promise of a follow-up, it left a bad taste in his mouth. He turned the key in the ignition, but instead of driving away, he circled the block and pulled into an empty lot within view of the house. And he waited. 5 minutes. 10. No flashing lights. No sirens. No squad car. James's grip tightened on the wheel. Something was wrong. After another few minutes of watching an utterly still house, he climbed out of the truck, careful to stay back, to keep his presence unnoticed. He didn't plan to go knocking again, not this time. He just needed to see. The trash bins sat near the curb, lids askew. James hesitated only a moment before stepping forward and lifting one. The scent hit him first. Not rotting food, not diapers or spoiled milk. Alcohol, pungent and thick, an unmistakable stench of beer and liquor bottles piled high. James swallowed against the burn in his throat and peered deeper. No food cartons, no discarded cereal boxes, nothing that said children live here. Then his eyes caught something else, something tucked between the bottles, barely visible in the mess. A length of rope, stiff with dried blood. Next to it, the crumpled remains of black duct tape. James let the lid fall closed, his heartbeat a slow, heavy drum in his ears. This wasn't neglect. This was something else entirely. James sat in his truck. He stared at the house. The note, the empty beer bottles, the blood-stained rope. It all pointed to something worse than neglect. His gut screamed at him to do something. But what? He had already called the police, and they had brushed him off. He glanced at the front door. Should he knock again? Confront Brad? But what if that made things worse? A sharp rap on the truck's side mirror startled him. James turned to see an elderly woman, her face lined with years of both kindness and weariness. She stood with her arms crossed, looking none too pleased. "You're blocking my driveway," she said, her voice a little rough, like someone who had spent years speaking over the wind. James sighed, rubbing his temple. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to block you. I was just—" He hesitated, then decided to tell her the truth. "I think something's wrong in that house." He nodded toward Brad's home. "I called the police, but they don't seem to be taking it seriously." The woman, Susan, followed his gaze, her expression shifting from irritation to something closer to concern. She exhaled slowly. "I'm not surprised. That house hasn't been right since his wife left. Poor woman took off months ago, left him alone with those 2 girls." James frowned. Left? Susan's mouth pressed into a thin line. That's what he tells everyone. But I've lived on this street long enough to know when something smells rotten. Before James could respond, the sudden bang of a door slamming open made them both turn. Two small figures burst out of the house, running full speed. James barely had time to register what was happening before one of the girls, Emma, flung herself at him, her tiny fists grabbing fistfuls of his shirt as if he were the only thing keeping her afloat. "Please," she sobbed. "Please help us." Her sister, Emily, was just a step behind, her face pale but determined. She didn't cry like Emma, but there was fear in her eyes. Then Brad appeared. He staggered through the doorway, his face red, his breath thick with the scent of alcohol. His eyes landed on James, dark and unfocused. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Brad slurred, voice sharp as broken glass. James immediately stepped in front of the girls, his stance firm. "They ran out of the house screaming for help," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. Brad's lips twisted into something between a sneer and a snarl. "They're my kids," he spat, "and you've got no damn right to interfere." Behind him, the front door stood wide open. The house loomed dark and hollow. Emma hid behind James, gripping his sleeve so tight he could feel her nails digging into his arm. But Emily didn't move. She stood still, staring straight at her father. For a moment, Brad faltered under her gaze. James could see it, the flicker of something behind those bloodshot eyes. Guilt, regret. But then, just as suddenly, it was gone. Brad scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "You know what?" His voice turned eerily calm, too calm. "Take them. Do whatever you want with them. I don't care anymore." He turned on his heel, stepping back into the house. And then the door slammed shut. The sound echoed down the street, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. James felt a cold shiver run through him. It wasn't just the words Brad had spoken, it was the emptiness in them, the way he said them, like he meant them. Emma cried harder, her small body shaking against James. Susan stepped forward, kneeling beside the girls. "You're safe now," she soothed, brushing Emma's hair from her tear-streaked face. "No one's going to hurt you." But Emily shook her head. "No," she whispered. Then louder, "No, we're not safe. Please, please help our mom." James stiffened. Susan's breath caught. The street, once filled with the hum of an ordinary afternoon, suddenly felt too still, too quiet. Emily's eyes burned with a desperation too heavy for a child to carry. "She's still in there," she whispered. "He won't let her go." 15 minutes had passed. James kept glancing at his watch, heart pounding harder with each second that ticked by. The girls were safe for now, but the weight of Emily's words pressed against his chest like a stone. He had called 911. He had told them it was urgent. Yet still, no sirens, no squad cars, no help. He clenched his fists, debating whether to call again, when a firm voice beside him cut through his frustration. "Wait." James turned to see Susan, her sharp gaze fixed on the street. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Calling again won't do much, but I know someone who will make them listen." Before James could ask what she meant, she waved over an older man stepping out of a nearby house. Martin Weist. Even before Susan introduced him, James could tell this was a man who commanded attention. Broad-shouldered despite his age, his presence carried the kind of weight that only came from years of experience. Martin served on the force for 25 years, Susan explained quickly. "If anyone can get them moving, it's him." Martin didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pulled out his phone, dialing directly to the local precinct. His voice, calm and authoritative, left no room for doubt. "This is Martin Weist. I need to know why a 911 call about an active child endangerment case has gone unanswered for 15 minutes. There is a known violent suspect in the home with a possible hostage." He paused. "No, I'm not asking. I'm telling you. Get a unit here now." James barely heard the response on the other end before Martin hung up. He turned back to them. They're on their way. And this time, James believed it. The first wail of sirens reached them minutes later. But before the squad cars could even come into view, the garage door groaned open. The mechanical whir cut through the tense silence, and then they saw him. Brad stood in the dim glow of the garage light, gripping Zena by the arm. Her hands were bound. A strip of fabric covered her eyes, and pressed against her temple, a gun. James felt Emma stiffen beside him, felt the way Emily's breath hitched. "Mama," Emily whispered, barely more than a breath. "Mama, you're alive." Zena was thinner than James had expected. Too thin. Her clothes hung loose, her frame gaunt. Even from a distance he could see the sharp angles of her collarbones, the hollowed-out look of her cheeks. But it was the way she stood completely still that made his stomach turn, like someone who had long since learned that movement led to pain. Emma let out a sob. But before she could call out, Brad's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Not another step," he barked. His hand tightened on Zena's arm, making her flinch. "Stay right where you are." The officers had arrived, stepping out of their cars with hands hovering near their weapons. One of them, a middle-aged man with graying hair, lifted his hands in a pacifying gesture. "Brad," the officer said evenly, "you don't want to do this. Let Zena go." Brad let out a short, bitter laugh. "You think I don't know what's happening here. You all think I'm some kind of monster." His voice wavered, switching from fury to desperation in a heartbeat. "I'm protecting my family. She was going to leave. She was going to take them from me." James clenched his jaw. "They were never safe with you." Beside him, Emily trembled, but she didn't back down. For the first time, Brad's gaze flicked to his daughters, and something inside him wavered. He swallowed hard, blinking as if suddenly seeing them for the first time in months. His grip on Zena loosened. James saw the officer shift his weight slightly, ready to move. But then, Brad's fingers tensed around the trigger. A decision was made. And so was the next one. A single gunshot split the night. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The sound still echoed, bouncing off the houses, the pavement, the sky. Brad's body jerked. Then he crumpled. The gun clattered to the ground. Zena staggered, but before she could fall, James was already moving. The moment his hands found her shoulders, she collapsed against him, shaking uncontrollably. Emma and Emily screamed, not from fear, not anymore, but because they could finally reach her. James barely had time to steady her before the girls were there, their arms wrapping around their mother in a desperate, wordless embrace. Zena's breath hitched. For the first time since the garage door had opened, she moved on her own. Her arms curled around her daughters, pulling them in, clinging to them. "I'm here," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, fragile, but firm. "I'm here. I'm here." And this time, she wasn't lying. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a pale glow over the sterile walls. But to Zena, the place felt almost warm. Warmer than the cold, dark attic where she had spent the last few months. She lay on the hospital bed, her body weak, her wrists still bearing the faint bruises from where Brad had grabbed her. But she was breathing freely. For the first time in months, she wasn't trapped. A nurse adjusted the IV in her arm, speaking softly, but Zena barely registered the words. Her mind was elsewhere, still caught in the nightmare she had just escaped. She turned her head slightly and saw Emily sitting beside her, perched on the chair, her small hands clenched in her lap. She hadn't left her side, not even for a second. Emma stood near the foot of the bed, clutching a juice box a nurse had given her, but barely sipping it. Her little shoulders were tense, her face unreadable. The weight of it all settled over Zena, the fear, the hunger, the isolation, and her daughters, her brave, brilliant daughters. A lump formed in her throat. She needed to tell the truth. She reached for Emily's hand, gripping it gently. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm okay now." Emily just nodded, but Zena could see the exhaustion in her young eyes. As the police came, she told them everything. How Brad had slowly taken away her freedom, first forbidding her from leaving the house, then from making phone calls, and finally locking her upstairs whenever he left. How he had controlled everything, the food she ate, the clothes she wore, even when she could see her own daughters. How he would come up to the attic, sometimes furious, sometimes eerily calm, always reminding her that she had nowhere else to go. "You belong to me, Zena. No one's coming for you. No one cares." His voice still echoed in her ears. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, but she forced herself to go on. When she finished, Emily's grip on her hand tightened. Emma, who had been silent, suddenly whispered, "If we hadn't run today, would you still be up there?" The words struck Zena like a blade. She pulled both of her daughters close, holding them as if she could shield them from the memories, from the terrible truth. "My sweet girls," she murmured into their hair, "you saved me. You're my angels." Emily's small voice was steady. "We knew we had to do something." And Zena realized they had been fighting for her just as much as she had been fighting for them. Later that evening, James arrived. He stepped into the hospital room cautiously, unsure if he was intruding, but Emma and Emily didn't hesitate. They ran straight to him, throwing their arms around his waist. James hesitated for only a moment before kneeling down, hugging them both tightly. "You did good, girls," he murmured. "You did real good." Emily pulled back slightly, looking up at him with serious eyes. "Thank you." James gave a small smile. "For what?" "If you hadn't helped us," Emily said quietly, "I don't think I could have saved Mom." James swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words. He wasn't used to thinking of himself as a hero, but today, maybe today was different. James had wondered how the girls had managed to write that note. Now, they told him. They had waited until Brad was in a drunken stupor. They had taken a scrap of paper, a marker Emily had hidden, and written their plea for help. Emma had suggested hiding it in one of the packages, knowing that James, the kind postman who came every day, might be the only one who would notice. Zena listened as they recounted the story, her heart aching at their resourcefulness. "You two," she whispered, pulling them into her arms again, "are the bravest girls I know." Meanwhile, the police had returned to Brad's house. A chilling detail emerged. They searched every corner of the place, and what they found made their stomachs turn. In Brad's study, there was a box of unopened surveillance cameras, still in their packaging. He had been planning to install them inside the house. One in the kitchen, one in the hallway, one in the attic. The detective shook his head. He wanted to watch them, control them. James clenched his jaw. Brad had never planned on letting Zena go, but now he was gone. and she was finally free. The night had been long. The officers were still collecting evidence from the house, still piecing together the remnants of a life that had unraveled in silence behind closed doors. But the biggest revelation came when they turned their attention to the package Brad had prepared for shipment. It sat in the back of James's mail truck, unassuming at first glance, just another brown cardboard box among countless others. But when the officers opened it, what they found inside sent a cold wave through the room. Zena's entire identity was inside that box: her passport, her social security card, bank records, insurance papers, even their marriage certificate. James stood at the edge of the investigation, watching as the lead officer flipped through the documents, his expression darkening with each passing second. Where was this package supposed to go? One officer muttered, scanning the shipping label. A younger officer leaned in, reading the address. His brows furrowed. It was meant for an address out of town, but it's familiar. This was their old house. Silence stretched between them. Zena and the girls had lived there before moving in with Brad, but they hadn't owned the property in years. "Who lives there now?" James asked. The officer exhaled, checking the records. "A man named Toby Hartman. He bought the house from Brad after the family moved." Susan, who had been standing nearby, let out a quiet, uneasy breath. "I remember Toby," she said. "He and Brad were thick as thieves, always whispering about something, always looking like they were up to no good." The lead officer nodded. "We need to get a unit there now." As the officers made their calls, the realization settled in like a creeping shadow. Why would Brad send every piece of Zena's identity to an old address? It wasn't just about controlling her. It wasn't just about trapping her. The implications were darker. One of the officers murmured almost to himself, if someone were planning to get rid of a person, they wouldn't keep their papers. They'd make them disappear. No one spoke after that. Within moments, a new team was dispatched to the old address, moving quickly to investigate any evidence of a larger plan, or worse, an accomplice. James watched them go, his stomach tight with unease. He had known Brad was dangerous. But this was something else. He glanced toward the hospital, where Zena and the girls were still recovering. They don't even know the worst of it yet. Inside the hospital room, Zena sat on the bed, her fingers moving gently through Emma's hair, combing out the tangles before tying it into a neat braid. The rhythmic motion calmed her. A small act of normalcy in a world that no longer felt normal. Emma had been quiet for a while, her little fingers playing with the edge of the hospital blanket. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Mummy, will Daddy come back for us?" Zena's hands faltered for just a second. She forced herself to keep braiding, to keep her fingers steady. She took a slow breath. "No, baby," she said softly. "He can't." Emma turned to look at her, searching her face for any sign of uncertainty. "Are you sure?" Zena met her daughter's eyes, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "I'm sure." Emma nodded, but the question lingered in her young eyes. Emily, who had been sitting on the edge of the bed, spoke next, her voice quieter, heavier. "He used to be different," she murmured. "Before..." She trailed off, her fingers curling around the hem of her sweater. Zena felt something inside her crack open at those words. She reached for them both, pulling them close, holding them the way she had wanted to for so long. "I know," she whispered. "I know he was." Emma buried her face against her mother's shoulder. Emily hesitated, then allowed herself to lean in, just a little. Zena closed her eyes. "I'm here now," she murmured, and I promise I'll make it better. She didn't know how, but she would. Somehow, she would. The night air was thick with tension. Even though Brad was gone, the unease surrounding his actions lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. The police had done their part, but James knew the story wasn't over. And he was right. Hours after the standoff, a team of officers arrived at the address listed on the package Brad had attempted to send out. A modest house, tucked away at the edge of town, its faded paint and overgrown lawn suggested years of neglect. But inside, hidden beneath layers of dust and forgotten belongings, the first thing they noticed was the stack of documents neatly placed on the dining table. Passports, birth certificates, property deeds, all belonging to Zena. Detective Howard, a man with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for never overlooking details, carefully lifted each paper, his eyes narrowing. "Why would Brad send this here?" one of the officers muttered. Another officer flipped through the documents, his brow furrowed. "These aren't just old records," he said. "They've been recently updated. Look at this." The papers included a transfer of ownership document, stating that all of Zena's assets, including the house and their joint savings, would belong solely to Brad. The date on it? 2 weeks before Zena had disappeared. Howard exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the paper. He was preparing for something. A silence settled over the officers as they exchanged looks. Brad wasn't just an abusive husband, he had a plan to erase Zena, not just from his life, but from existence itself. And yet, as damning as these documents were, something didn't add up. Howard's gaze drifted to the bottom of the transfer papers. 2 signatures, one was Brad's. The other? It wasn't Zena's. It was close, but not quite right. The loops were exaggerated, the pressure uneven, as if someone had tried to forge her name. Howard's stomach twisted. Brad didn't do this alone. Back at the station, Zena sat stiffly in a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The fluorescent lights cast a cold glow over the small room, but she barely noticed. Her mind was back at the garage, back to the gun pressed against her head, back to the way Brad had held her like she was nothing more than a bargaining chip. She shivered. A warm hand touched hers gently. She looked up. It was Emily. "Mama," the girl whispered, squeezing her fingers. "You're safe now." Zena's throat tightened, but before she could speak, the door creaked open. Detective Howard stepped in. His expression was unreadable, but Zena could sense something behind his carefully measured gaze. "We found something," he said, taking the seat across from her. "At the address Brad was sending your documents to." Zena straightened. "What did you find?" Howard hesitated, then slid the papers across the table. "You should see for yourself." Her hands trembled as she reached for them. The moment her eyes landed on the transfer document, her breath caught. "My name," she whispered, fingertips ghosting over the forged signature. "I never signed this." "We know," Howard said. "And that's why we need to ask, do you have any idea who might have helped Brad do this?" Zena swallowed hard. Brad had never been one to handle paperwork. He hated legal documents, always muttering about how tedious they were. But there was someone who did, someone who had always been in the background. Her mind raced, piecing together moments she had overlooked before. Conversations half heard, whispered phone calls late at night. Then it hit her. She looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "His brother." Howard's jaw tightened. "Mason William?" Zena nodded, her pulse quickening. "Brad's older brother. He was always around helping with finances. He had access to all of our accounts. If anyone could have faked my signature, it would be him." Howard exchanged a look with his partner. Mason William. Unlike Brad, Mason had always kept a lower profile, but maybe that was the point. Brad had been reckless, violent, unpredictable. But Mason was the careful one, the one who knew how to cover tracks, how to make things look legal on paper. And if Brad had been working with him, then this wasn't just a case of domestic abuse. This was something far more calculated. Howard leaned forward. "Zena, listen to me carefully. You and your daughters are safe for now, but if Mason was involved in this, we can't rule out the possibility that he's still a threat." Zena's hands curled into fists. The nightmare wasn't over. The shelter wasn't much, but it was safe. A modest two-bedroom unit in a quiet part of town, tucked away from the noise, from the weight of what they had left behind. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but it was a place to breathe, a place where the doors locked from the inside, not the outside. Zena sat on the small couch, her arms wrapped around herself. It had been 3 days since she and the girls had arrived, 3 days since Brad had fallen, 3 days since she had felt the sun on her face without fearing what lay beyond the front door. Across the room, Emma sat curled up in the corner of the bed, her little hands clutched into fists. Every time the door opened, even if it was just the caseworker checking in, her whole body would tense, her breath hitching as if expecting the worst. Emily, though only a year older, had taken on a quiet strength. She had always been the braver one, the protector. That had become clear to everyone in the last few days. Zena watched as Emily climbed onto the bed beside her sister, wrapping her arms around her. "It's okay," Emily murmured. "Nobody can hurt us anymore." Emma didn't answer, but after a moment, she exhaled shakily and let her sister hold her. Zena closed her eyes, pressing a hand to her mouth to keep the sob inside. 3 days later, Zena stood outside a small cafe, her heart pounding as she waited. James had agreed to meet them. She had wanted, needed, to see him again. Not because she owed him, but because he had become a part of their story in a way she couldn't ignore. She glanced down at Emily and Emma, who stood beside her, their small hands gripping hers. Then the cafe door opened, and there he was. James looked just as she remembered. Steady, quiet, kind. A man who had not been looking for heroism, but had found it anyway. When his eyes met hers, something unspoken passed between them. Zena stepped forward. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "For everything." James shifted slightly, as if unsure what to do with the weight of her gratitude. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do," she insisted, reaching for his hand. "Because if it weren't for you, She paused, her throat tightening. "I don't know where we'd be." Emma, still shy, clung to her mother's side, but Emily moved forward, lifting her small arms and wrapping them around James's waist. "Thank you, Mr. James," she whispered. For a moment, James simply stood there. Then, slowly, he knelt, meeting Emily at eye level. "You're a strong girl," he said gently. "You and your sister both." Emily nodded solemnly, and, for the first time in days, Zena saw a flicker of light in her daughter's eyes. Emma hesitated, then, after a long pause, she too reached for James. He held them both, not as a savior, not as a rescuer, but as a man who had simply done the right thing. Weeks passed. Emma and Emily started school again. At first, Emma flinched at loud noises. She sat near the door, in case she needed to run. But Emily held her hand every day, in the classroom, at recess, even on the walk home. "You're safe," she reminded her. "We both are." Their caseworker arranged therapy sessions, helping them understand that fear didn't mean weakness, that healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about learning to live beyond the pain. And Zena? She found a job. Something simple, something steady. For the first time in years, she could open her own bank account, buy her own groceries, make her own choices. The past still lingered, of course. It would always linger. But she had learned something in that garage, in that terrible moment when she had felt Brad's grip around her arm, the cold press of metal against her skin. She had learned that survival wasn't just about enduring. One evening, as the sky turned soft with dusk, James pulled up to his last delivery stop. The day had been long, but as he stepped out of his truck, he wasn't just a mailman anymore. Something had shifted, because he had seen it with his own eyes, how paying attention, how acting on instinct, how caring could change someone's life. As he locked the truck and walked toward the door, a thought settled deep inside him. Sometimes the smallest moments could save a life. And that, my friends, is the power of paying attention, of listening to that quiet voice inside that tells you something isn't right. James wasn't looking to be a hero, he was just doing his job. But because he chose to care, because he refused to look away, he changed the course of 3 lives forever. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, powerful stories just like this one. And remember, sometimes being a hero starts with nothing more than paying attention. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next story.